Periodically, it seems, society gets a rash of atheists. Not a bad metaphor, actually, because they can be very irritating. But sometimes a rash can get us off our backside and make us get on our feet and consider things that we might ought to be doing. And that's possibly true in this case. The September 11th edition of Newsweek featured an article in their religion section entitled "The New Naysayers" by Jerry Adler. It was fascinating to read because when I did an internet search on those exact words, "the new naysayers," I came up with 250,000 hits. And the way I do that, I put them in quotes, so I'm sure I'm getting precisely that phrase when it comes back. It's an old idea, the naysayers and all this. So people speak about it a lot. Now, the article is pretty fair, and I think more balanced than many of the things I read in Newsweek. The subtitle is this: "In the midst of religious revival, 3 scholars argue that atheism is smarter." Now, naturally, they think that because they are atheists and they're smarter. At least, well, they probably are smarter than your average bear. So, because these guys are well educated, they probably have very high IQs. But if there are only 3 of them, you really don't find that. That doesn't quite make a movement. There are more atheists than that, but that could be the whole range of atheist scholars. I don't know. Nevertheless, they're intelligent men, and what they have to say might bear some examination and some thought on our part because of the implications it may have. Jerry Adler said this: "Americans answered the atrocities of September 11th overwhelmingly with faith. Attacked in the name of God, they turned to God for comfort. In the week after the attacks, nearly 70% said they were praying more than usual. Confronted by a hatred that seemed inexplicable, Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson proclaimed that God was mad at America because it harbored feminists, gays, and civil libertarians. Well, I really don't necessarily think that God is happy with America, but that's the reasons for it reach a whole lot further out than that." Sam Harris, who was then a 34-year-old graduate student in neuroscience, had a different reaction. On September the 12th, he began a book. If, he reasoned, young men were slaughtering people in the name of religion, something had been going on since long before 2001, then perhaps the problem was religion itself. His book would be called "The End of Faith," which to most Americans probably sounds like a lament. To Harris, it was something to be encouraged. Now, this is really old hat. Thinkers for generations have been playing around not only with an end to faith, but with items like the death of God, and so on. There's nothing new about this. Harris won an award for his book, so he's in the process of writing another one, naturally. There's also another book that came out this year. It was called "Breaking the Spell" by philosopher Daniel Dennett, who asks how and why religions became ubiquitous in human society. The obvious answer: because they're true, is foreclosed, Dennett says, by the fact that they are, by and large, mutually incompatible. Now, the statement is true, but it's irrelevant. All religions, indeed, cannot be true. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that that's fact. Both Christianity and Islam cannot both be true. But that hardly forecloses the question. Why and how we have religions, why have they become ubiquitous in human society, is an important question, and it's not nearly so easily dismissed. Then there's another book coming out. Next month, the British evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, who some of you may have heard of him, he weighs in with The God Delusion, a book that extends the argument he advanced in the days after 9/11. After hearing once too often that, quote, "to blame the attacks on Islam is like blaming Christianity for the fighting in Northern Ireland," Dawkins responded, "Precisely. It's time to get angry, and not only with Islam." So he basically equates the two types of things. Now, one wonders, I certainly did as I read through this, if any of these men realize we're not talking about God in virtually any of the things that they're talking about. We are talking about sectarian abuse of religion, both in Northern Ireland and in Iraq and in Iran and various and sundry other parts of the world that led up to 9/11 as well. They ask, where do people get their idea of God? From the Bible or the Quran? Tell a devout Christian that frozen yogurt can make a man invisible. Okay, say with him, tell a Christian that frozen yogurt can make a man invisible, and he is likely to require as much evidence as anyone else and be persuaded only to the extent you give it. Tell him that the book he keeps by his bed was written by an invisible deity who will punish him with fire for eternity if he fails to accept its every incredible claim about the universe, and he seems to require no evidence whatever. Now, I don't know if you see quickly through the absurdity of what that man said there. What bothers me about this line of argument is not merely that it's wrong about what the Bible says. That's patently obvious. But that the argument is being made by scholars who presumably know they are presenting a one-sided view of the Bible. Now, how can I judge that they know this? Well, you know what PhD means after a man's name. Somebody said piled higher and deeper. It's not supposed to. It's not supposed to. I remember when I was doing some of my work in master's thesis and later on doctor's degree, one of the points that was made is that the very existence of the words PhD after a man's name means that this man has been through the process, the discipline of education in a particular field, his particular field. He knows enough not to speak outside of his field. He knows enough, if his PhD is in metaphysics, he knows enough not to speak in terms of biology, because that's not his field. He is expected as a doctor of philosophy not to do that kind of thing. It means that he has mastered at least 2 languages besides his own. It means quite a lot. He's also learned how to present his ideas in an orderly fashion. And then whenever you're reading a PhD's paper, book, or what have you, and he has that little footnote by it, and you go and look at the footnote, it gives you a reference of a book, an author, a date, a page number, where this quote of his came from. If he has a PhD after his name, scholars expect that that statement will be true. That if you go to the book, you look it up, you come down there, you'll find it. It is correct, not only in the way it's quoted, it's correct in context. It also advances the man's argument. Now, if you, when you read a book by a PhD, make that assumption, you are making a grievous error in the process. Because PhDs are just like everybody else in the world. They lie. They misquote. Not all of them, and not all the time. But the point is, you can't trust a PhD an awful lot further than you can trust a used car salesman. I mean, a used car salesman tells you stuff about a car. You want to know more. You want to look into it, don't you? I've had this experience where I have actually been working on my master's thesis, and I came across a statement in in a PhD's book about the Old Testament. It had to do with an obscure controversy about the Yahwist, Elohist, and so forth, the documentary hypothesis. And he cited as an example the number of times in one psalm that the word Yahweh was used. This was given to advance the argument that he was making that this particular psalm could be dated in a particular period of time. I said, okay. But then I looked at his source. And when I looked at his source said precisely the same thing, so he correctly cited his course because he was a PhD. This guy was a PhD, and he had every right to assume that PhD was telling the truth. Well, I got my little trusty Bible out, and I actually went to the psalm in question, and I counted for myself the number of occurrences of the word Yahweh. He was off by a factor of double. The numbers were wrong. One PhD accepted what another PhD had said without bothering to go back and count the words himself in the psalm. It goes on all the time, which means you've got to be kind of careful when you're reading stuff when somebody says, he's a scholar, he says this. Well, yeah, but he may be depending on another scholar who's depending on another scholar who was trying to get his paper through a doctoral committee and lied, misrepresented, put a footnote in it and a quote that was not justified. Now, I've seen it directly. I've seen it where a PhD actually withdrew, took a citation out of a book, put it in his thesis. It was correct. It was word for word correct. But he didn't bother to mention that in context, he was saying exactly the opposite thing the original author was saying. And he had to know that. He had to know that. So you can write this one down and remember it, that if a scholar misrepresents, if a scholar begins to violate the rules of logic, you realize that something is going on because this man is supposed to know better. And because he put PhD after his name, you can assume that he does know better. And having made that assumption, you can make a little bit of progress down the road. Now, they should be aware the Bible doesn't say that. The Christian preachers may say it, Muslim imams may say it, but God and the Bible don't. What they have done is to set up a straw man and then burn it. And if they are scholars, if they are worthy of the name, they know what they're doing. And that, to me, is the disturbing thing, and I begin to suspect they're being intellectually dishonest for whatever reason. God only knows what that is. Man may have reasons for not wanting to believe in God. One of the Huxleys, I forget which one it was, who called himself Darwin's bulldog, plainly admitted that one of the reasons why he wanted to believe in evolution was because belief in religion interfered with his sex life. Continuing now with Harris, he asks, how can anyone believe in a benevolent and omnipotent God who permits a tsunami to swallow 180,000 innocent people in a few hours? How does it advance our understanding of the universe to suppose it was created by a supernatural being who communicates only through a one-way process of revelation? Now, this kind of argumentation is really grating for me because I know that the author knows better than what he is writing here. Let's start with a statement that the book we keep by our bed was written by God. There may be a fringe element of Christian people who believe precisely that God wrote it. Harris knows well enough that no serious Christian scholar makes that claim, because any serious Christian scholar has learned better than that a long time ago. Let's start with the four Gospels. Is there anyone out there who seriously believes that God took pen in hand and wrote these books? Is there anyone out there that believes that these four Gospels fell down from heaven, completely written by God, all put together perfectly in the first place, and that's the way they actually come into existence? I don't think so. Not, there may be, as I say, some fringe element out there somewhere that believes that, but good grief, there are people who believe anything. Let me clarify for you. Let's actually get this straight. These books were actually penned on scrolls by four men whose names we know and who were well known in the first century to the people to whom, or by the people to whom these particular Gospels were written or for whom they were written. These men tell us plainly enough, make it clear that they are giving their testimony of what they have seen and what they have heard. Biblical law requires at least 2 witnesses. We have been given 4, a superabundance of witnesses. Now let me explain something very important about witnesses. Their testimony is useless. It is corrupted if you don't allow them complete freedom in telling their story. You follow me? A witness's testimony is useless if he's not free to tell his story. This being the case, you have in the Gospels the normal variations that you would get from any set of witnesses who were describing the same events. They will always vary in important ways. In court, that variance is truly important for a reason not many people think about. You know what it is? It establishes the fact that the witnesses are independent. If you get 4 witnesses that come into court, they tell exactly the same story, the events in exactly the same way, they have all the details precisely the same as each other, what are you going to conclude? Well, they may or may not be lying, but you're going to conclude they sure have been woodshedded. They've been taken out by their lawyer into the woodshed, same lawyer, and they have been helped to get their story exactly correct and all in the same order. That's what goes on. There are reasons why we have what we have. One may seem more important than another fact than other. Others may not have been present when something happened. Some of them couldn't record what had happened in an event because they weren't there to see it. Other people may have seen it from the other side of the event, looking back this way, and saw something that the first witness did not see. So you get all sorts of little odds and ends. Then you have this rather interesting one. I don't have the reference for you, but it's well, documented. There's one set of events in Luke that occur in 1, 2, 3 order. These same 3 events are recorded in one of the other Gospels, I forget which, in 1, 3, 2 order. They are not recorded in precisely the same way. Now, here's the question. Did the events not occur? Well, nobody wants to argue the events didn't take place. So what's the big deal in the fact that they are out of order in one of the Gospels? Well, it treads across the old idea of biblical inerrancy, but it really doesn't have to. Not when you understand some things. Did Luke record them not in the order of the time they occurred, but did he do it in order to clarify the issue in an order he deemed important? Because 1, 2, and 3, you will focus on 1 and 3 more than you will on 2. It's just one of the ways the human mind works. And so Luke may have deliberately decided to do it in a different order. Also, and I didn't really realize this until recently, that the Hebrew way of putting together a long document, the climax comes in the middle. Not at the end, where we get used to them in novels and what have you. And so consequently, you can oftentimes go to the middle of a Hebrew document and find where the climax of this thing is. Everything builds up to it, everything winds down from it. And so the order in which you tell the story can become important in and of itself. Okay, you should know that biblical writers were not doing term papers. They were not using the Chicago Book of Style. Many of the standards that we have developed are to aid writers and editors, and they have arisen in the days of print, now in the days of desktop publishing, and they are all very helpful in helping people read and understand a written page. But they didn't have any of that. As a consequence, many standards of accuracy that are important to us were not deemed important to them. There was, for example, no distinction that was made in ancient writers between direct and indirect quotations. Now, do you all know what I mean by direct and indirect quotations? Direct quotations have got quotes around them, and they are supposed to be verbatim, word for word, precisely what the person said or wrote. Indirect quotations don't have the quotation marks, and consequently are a paraphrase or what the author remembers of what the individual said or the individual wrote. Well, there was no distinction of this in ancient time, and for one thing, they had no way in many cases of getting the precise quotation down on paper anyway, because they didn't have the person who spoke it or said it there to witness it. So as a consequence, many of these things are simply, that we think are important, they didn't. What was important to them was truth. And their way of approaching this, they told the truth. If their story varied in unimportant ways from other witnesses, that only served to establish the independence of the witnesses, and it's what gives the 4 Gospels their power, their incredible power. A lot of people look at the variations from gospel to gospel and think, oh, I've disproved the Bible. How silly can you get? You have to understand they are witnesses. They did not collaborate. They weren't looking over at one another's paper and copying off what the other guy was saying, regardless of what some scholars think they did. They were all independent witnesses. They saw Jesus. They listened to Jesus. They touched him. They hugged him. They put their fingers in his side after he was resurrected. They knew Jesus. And they told the truth about him. And I think this is a crucial element in understanding that the power of the 4 Gospels comes from the simple fact they are the testimony of witnesses. And regardless, you have to decide, do I believe the witnesses or don't I? That's what all juries have to do. And that's why the word believe becomes so important as you read through the Scriptures. There's a term among lawyers, I already mentioned it, for what happens when you coach a witness as to what he's going to say on the stand. Woodshedding. You take him to the woodshed, you get the story straight. And the problem with this is that if this comes out in testimony, the witness can become completely disqualified in the eyes of the jury. If they think this guy has been told what to say by his lawyer, he can forget about bringing him to the stand. You have to let the witness tell his story. And that is precisely what God has done in the New Testament with the Gospels, and in fact, in the entire Bible. Every single book of the Bible was written by some man in his style, using his vocabulary and through his eyes and through his ears. This in no way denies inspiration. But I want to tell you something very important, and I hope you will try to get a hold of this because it's not that easy sometimes for Christian people to get. You cannot presume inspiration. In other words, you can't go to take the Bible to one of these atheists and put it down in front of him and say, I'm assuming that this is inspired by God, and therefore I want you to read it and accept what it says. No. Well, what then do you have to do? You have to establish the inspiration, and you can only establish the inspiration by what? By the truth of what is being written. You can only establish inspiration by the truth of the testimony of the witnesses. Did they tell the truth? And if it's obvious, if you could drag them into court and have them before a jury, and you're on that jury, if you decide you believe what these men are writing and saying, you have established a presumption of divine inspiration. Because that divine inspiration is claimed. But as again, you cannot assume it. Then you can see plainly that God inspired the biblical writers to record the truth about their encounters with God and their encounters with history. You can't address the doubts that these atheist scholars raise in their students unless you know how they work. You just simply can't do it. According to Jerry Adler, like the fundamentalists, the atheists prefer to read the Bible literally, especially the parts about stoning people to death. There's a popular thing going around right now about people asking a question about stoning people to death. But, this is the funny thing about it is, why are they assuming that you have to read the Bible literally when relatively few Christian people believe that? They know the Bible is full of figurative language. They know it's full of symbolism. They know that God does not always intend to be taken literally, and that you can tell when he does and when he doesn't. I always used to ask my questions, one of the students, when I was teaching Bible, I say, where would you look to demonstrate that Jesus did not intend always to be taken literally? One of them, if your right hand offends you, cut it off. Because after all, if you stole something, is your right hand really what's to blame? If we cut off what's to blame, we're kind of at the end of the road. Now he goes on, Jerry Adler says, as for the Bible, Harris, like the fundamentalists, prefers a literal reading. He quotes at length the passages in the Old and New Testaments that deal with how to treat slaves. Why, he asked, would anyone take moral instruction from a book that calls for stoning your children to death for disrespect, or for heresy, or for violating the Sabbath? Obviously, our culture no longer believes in that, he adds, so why not agree that science has made it equally unnecessary to invoke God to explain the sun or the weather or your own existence? Now, sometimes these guys get a little bit tiresome because they advance arguments in a way that a scholar should know is wrong. It won't work. It doesn't add up. One of the first things to know about this, and I'm amazed at times how men who are reputed to be scholars can misrepresent the argument that they are prepared to refute. One of the first things to know about this, and I've already made this point, about reputed scholars being just as prone to dishonesty and misrepresentation as any other segment of society. You can take yourself 100 people, ordinary guys, take 100 scholars over here, same percentage of them probably will be dishonest or inaccurate in their doings. Now, why does he choose only one reading of the Bible to oppose and then to deconstruct in his argument? One reason. It works better. Now, you wonder how this guy would be doing if he were doing biology or astronomy, simply choosing one theory or another because it works better. So where's the rigor going to come from in these things? But let me take the issues he raises to illustrate what I mean. First, slavery. Now, they know, these guys, if they've read their Bible, if they've done any study, if they've taken this question seriously at all, they know that Israel was a society without prisons. It's surprising how often people don't, have to shake their heads a moment and say, well, I guess that's right. There was no Attica there. There was no Folsom prison there. There was no place with walls where you could be locked up in a cell forever, how long, and given food and clothing and shelter and everything else for free. There was nothing like that in Israel at all. Slavery existed under certain circumstances and with very serious regulation. And consequently, it could be for theft. It could be for any number of things that you could be sold into slavery, put up on a block, sold off. Whatever it was you stole, paid back to somebody else. And when you'd paid it off in slavery, you would be released and sent on your way. It could happen. There was a limit to the period of time you could be a slave, like 7 years. And so, really, it was very tightly regulated. Now, today, we arrest men off the street. We prove their guilt through due process, and we deprive them of their freedom. How does that differ from slavery? In what important aspect does it differ from slavery? And how can a putative scholar say that our culture no longer believes in slavery when we practice it by another name? I have an old friend who is in jail right now, and he can't go where he wants to do. He can't eat what he wants. He has to eat prison food, and that can be a pretty bad thing from time to time. And he has a job in the prison that he has to go to. And he goes in there and he works in that job, in that prison, for pennies. He is a slave. He manufactures something for the state. He made courtroom furniture for a judge. He did, whatever it is they tell him to do, he does it. He could rebel. He could refuse. And then he spends all day, every day, in a cell somewhere with nothing whatever to do and very little to read except what somebody might bring by from the prison library. So, like a slave, he does what he's told. As I said, how can a scholar tell us that we don't do this anymore when we actually do it? We just do it with another name. The Israelite system, by the way, was arguably better than our own. From what I read here, I would far rather be a slave under the Israelite system than in a slammer under our system. The next thing he brought up was stoning children for disrespect. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 21, chapter 21 of Deuteronomy, verse 18, here is the passage in question. If a man have a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and when they have chastened him, he still won't listen to them. I mean, we have got ourselves a really bad kid here. Then shall his father or his mother lay hold on him and bring him out unto the elders of his city, to the gate of his place. Due process ensues. They shall say to the elders of the city, this our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. And the men of the city shall stone him with stones that he die. So shall you put away evil from among you. All Israel shall hear and shall fear. Now, frankly, I doubt that this penalty ever had to be executed. If it did, it probably never happened more than once, because it would have a marvelous way of focusing the mind of a rebellious and stubborn child. We still practice due process, and the death penalty is never applied in quite this way, but it's erroneous to say that society does nothing like this at all any longer. Nor does it say that Moses was wrong to strictly defend the order of the family at that time, in that place, under those circumstances, in that way. Because there was no jail to send this teenage malcontent into. We couldn't send him off. I forget the name of the place here in Tyler where they send young people and do whatever it is they do with them up there to try to make them into meaningful people in society. The family was the unit that did this in that world, and when the family could no longer do anything about it, you have a choice. Well, in our world, we can send him to jail. They had no jails. And in order to defend the family in that society, after due process, the child was put to death. The law does establish the near absolute authority of the parents in the family, and I think that's important. Exodus 21, verse 5, he that smites his father or his mother shall be sure to be put to death. Now, smiting is a little bit more than just reaching out and punching in a moment of anger, I'm quite sure. I think this is a much more serious injury to father or mother, and they're going to be put to death for that. Now, Harris spoke of stoning for heresy and for Sabbath breaking. I really don't know what he means by heresy. I can't recall the word even being used in the Old Testament. I don't know what he's driving at. I know quite well that there is no law dealing with stoning for Sabbath breaking alone, for what shall I call it, mere Sabbath breaking. There was a specific instance of stoning for Sabbath breaking, as far as I know, only one, that took place while Israel was in the wilderness, where discipline had to prevail. You find this in Numbers, the chapter 15. The incident occurs not in a historical narrative. It occurs in a legal context. In Numbers 15, verse 27, this is important to understand about this. If a person sins unintentionally, it's kind of hard to figure in it, but it's true. If there is an unintentional sin, I didn't understand, I think probably they would have even included a sin of weakness, a sin involved with circumstances. I have because there is due process in Israelite law before anyone could be deprived of life or liberty. Okay? Just like in our own Constitution. Well, if a person sins unintentionally, he shall bring a female goat in its first year as a sin offering. So the priest shall make an atonement for the person who sins unintentionally, when he sins unintentionally, before the Lord, to make an atonement for him. And it shall be forgiven him. I screwed up. Okay. You bring an offering, you pay a fine, as it were, and you will be forgiven. You shall have one law for him that sins unintentionally, for the man that's native born, for the stranger that dwells among you. But, now here we come to a different element. The person who does anything presumptuously. The word presumptuously, as it's used in Hebrew, basically means high-handedly. If a person who does it is in your face attitude in what he does. If the person does anything in presumptuously, whether he is native born or a stranger, that one brings reproach on the Lord, and he shall be cut off from among his people, because he has despised the word of the Lord and has broken his commandment, that person shall be completely cut off. His guilt shall be upon him. But once again, there must be due process to determine intent. There's nothing unusual about that. In our courts, intent is very important. If you're accused of fraud, for example, there is something called constructive fraud, which means it was a fraud that you committed without really realizing you were committing a fraud. And then there is regular intentional fraud, where they have to demonstrate that you intended it to be done this way. So we got that in our system of law. They had it in theirs. Later on now, in what it follows in here, is an example of administrative law in dealing with this. Numbers 15:32. While the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation. They put him under guard, because it had not been explained to them what should be done. They didn't have that administrative rule. And the Lord said to Moses, the man must surely be put to death, and all the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. Okay, the man was not executed without due process. He was not executed for a sin of ignorance or even of weakness. It is an example of presumptuous, defiant sin when the man knew better than what he was doing and says, I don't care what you say, I'm going to do it anyway. Now, if you compare this, say, to a fellow who had been neglected to get sufficient firewood in, and his wife goes into labor sometime on Friday night, it's very cold, and he goes out and gathers firewood to build a fire to keep his house warm, or his tent warm, while his wife is giving birth to this child. Do we take that guy out and stone him for gathering sticks on the Sabbath day? No. You bring him in, if it's a problem, if there's any question about it, due process goes through, people understand it was a sin through not necessarily ignorance in this case, but a sin of necessity. And the judges would decide what to do. He might have to do a sacrifice, as I said, similar to paying a fine. He might have to do nothing at all if they decided to write it off. Due process allowed a lot of leeway to judges in ancient Israel, something that these scholars really ought to know, but they choose to ignore. And that's the thing that kind of frosts me when I read some of the things that they write. I can imagine any number of situations where a man might get caught up short, and feel he had to gather wood. I think it would be treated properly. As I said, these men who are reputed to be scholars, scholarship is a disciplined approach. Discipline makes demands on scholars, which they have to live up to if they're going to be held in reputation. And if they're going to write about these things, they have an obligation to be thorough and make it clear that they're being fair. And they're not. They choose deliberately, not only to read literally, but to take a fundamentalist approach to interpretation, even when they know that that is the minority interpretation among Christian folks. I consider that intellectually dishonest. Jerry Adler comes back and says, these are not brand new arguments, of course. Believers have well-practiced replies to them, although in some cases, such as the persistence of evil and suffering, the theodicy problem, the responses are still mostly works in progress. Now, theodicy is the term for how it's possible that we could have a God who is good, and he created a good creation, and it's a world in which there exists so much evil. The word, again, is theodicy. Now, it may be my work and may be a work in progress, but I think I have offered an answer in the book, The Lonely God, and it is simplicity itself. God is good. He made man free. Everything else after that is just commentary. God is good. He made man free. And thus it is man, not God, who is the author of so much evil in the world. One raised the issue, as I read earlier, about the tsunami in Asia that claimed so many lives. What's the answer to that? Well, people know about tsunamis. They still choose to put themselves in harm's way, to be there in a place where a tsunami was possible. God didn't insist that they be there. The earth is the earth. It has physical properties. It has a huge amount of mass. That creates a molten core. The continents float on that core. And this thing moves all the time, and we know it does. We have known it from time immemorial. And we don't think a thing in the world about putting ourselves in harm's way. How many people died on Mount St. Helens when it erupted? I don't remember exactly what the number was. Did they know? Yeah, they knew. Well, how in the world blame their death on God? I'll tell you what it sounds like to me. It sounds like so much philosophical whining. People whining about, well, why did God let this happen? Why did God let those people die? Why did God let those people die in an earthquake? Well, because they built these houses out of mud huts and put heavy stuff over their heads in them in an area where earthquakes were known to happen. You don't die in an earthquake probably if you're in a tent somewhere. The tent may fall around your ears and you may have to climb out from under it, but that's about it. Rescue maybe your kids out from under there. Jerry Adler again. Dawkins, as brilliant as he is, overlooks something any storefront Baptist preacher might have told him. If there is no God, why be good? He asked rhetorically. He responds, do you mean the only reason you try to be good is to gain God's approval and reward? That's not morality. That's sucking up. That's really clever. But he knows better than that. Millions of Christians and Muslims believe that it was precisely God who turned them away from a life of immorality. Dawkins, of course, thinks they are deluding themselves. He is correct that the social utility of religion doesn't prove anything about the existence of God. I would agree with him on that. But for all his erudition, he seems not to have spent much time among ordinary Christians who could have told him what God meant to them. And many of whom could have told him that he was reading his Bible wrong. And he was trying to make it say things that suited his own predilections, not the truth. In this little exchange, something very important emerges. If God doesn't exist, there is no standard of morality and no reason why I shouldn't steal if I can get away with it. It's not sucking up. It's just a question that if it's okay to steal, then if I can get away with it, why shouldn't I? And what complaint do I have about somebody stealing from me? Can I accuse him of doing something wrong? Well, what made it wrong? Well, the laws of the country made it wrong, I guess, but where'd they come from? Nancy Pearcey, writing about Immanuel Kant, noted that he saw the paradox of morality in all this. She said that Kant could not maintain both sides of the paradox as equally true. For in the realm of facts, he was talking about things that actually exist, the things that are in the real world. But while in the real world, he was talking about a realm of concepts or principles that we assume only because they are necessary for morality. What she means is by this is that Kant, says we have the real world here, that we know exactly what that is. Over here, we have an unreal world in which we assume principles because we have to, in order for there to even be morality. Quote, since morality requires freedom of the will, we must suppose ourselves to be free, no matter what science says to the contrary, since the correspondence of happiness and virtue cannot be left to mere coincidence. We must suppose that it is God who guarantees it. Basically what he is saying is it has to be this way in order for us to function in the world. Therefore, we will do it, even though God doesn't have a thing in the world to do with it. Of course, he will do it as long as it is convenient, and if it's inconvenient, he won't. Ms. Piercy's conclusion, the atheist must divide life into what we know and what we can't help believing. In the end, she said, Kant threw up his hands and simply insisted that regardless of what science says, we must act as if we were free. Because what he means by that is science is all deterministic. You aren't really free. You're just a collection of nerves and brain cells and things that all this stuff is going off and firing and creating reactions that have nothing to do with free will. You don't really have any choice. You're doing whatever that sequence of events leads you to do. But we have to act as if we were free. She says that little phrase gives away the store. It implies that we know better, that we're tricking ourselves, and that moral freedom is a little more than a useful fiction. Now, where do you end up when you try to create a worldview without God? This is what Nancy Piercy is driving at. Where are you going to wind up when you try to do that? We create our own morality and meaning through our choices. That means we can also recreate them whenever we choose. Fair enough. If I create my own morality and I find later on it's inconvenient, I can just recreate it in a new form that is more convenient for me. Nothing justifies the normative definition of, say, marriage as a lifetime union between a husband and a wife. That social pattern is not inherent and original in human nature because nothing is inherent. That is, she's citing the atheist's point of view. It's not inherent. Nothing is inherent and original in human nature. Cultural patterns emerge gradually over the course of human evolution, are rising by naturalistic causes, and lasting only as long as they're expedient for survival. And I might add, not even that long if it's really expedient. Embezzlement, comes to mind if you're in the right place at the right time. Now, what all this is talking about is a simple truth. The atheist cannot live with all the implications of his belief system. He has to make a leap of faith. I really hadn't quite got that clear in my head for a long time, that he cannot live with that. Because if you start asking questions and you start taking it out into its ultimate conclusions, you go off into absurdity, and it won't work. And they know that. They choose to believe what they believe. In fact, someone said that the atheist's belief system is much easier than the agnostic's because he bases it on faith, whereas the agnostic is at least trying to work it out in terms of what he knows and what he doesn't know. Anyway, I began to understand why Francis Schaeffer entitled one of his books, Escape from Reason. He says that one of the great it's a description of the great intellectual lostness of our age. Many are forced to hang their entire hopes for dignity and meaning on something that they themselves regard as non-cognitive and unverifiable. So they have to hang that on that. And the result of that, and I remember reading in one of his books, they wind up falling below the line of desperation, the line of despair, because there is no meaning in their lives whatsoever. They have to construct a meaning for their lives out of a common morality which they know has no verification in fact. Piercy again. This is not a merely intellectual analysis. We're talking about a split that divides a person's inner life, creating enormous tension. And listen to this. When we evangelize among people who have accepted a divided field of knowledge, we must press them to face squarely the terrifying reality of this jagged split running right through their own thought world. The very fact that they have to make a leap of faith shows that the scientific naturalism they have accepted is not an adequate worldview. It does not explain human nature as everyone experiences it, as even themselves experience it. Now, when she speaks of evangelizing among such people, she may be talking about your own sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters who are university educated. Because this divide that exists in people's minds between the world of fact and the world of values, as she describes it, creates a division in people's lives that simply won't work. It's a fallacious worldview, and it is a fault line that could eventually create an earthquake in the person's life. And when you're trying to do evangelism with these people, you have to help them face that divide and to face the implications of what they believe, to face the implications of where it might someday lead them if they continue to follow it according to that divided line in their lives. Nancy Pearcey is arguing for, in her book Total Truth, for a unified view of God and not one that is divided. She says, in evangelism, our task is to bring people face to face with this contradiction between what a person says he believes and what his entire life is telling him. The gospel then becomes good news indeed. The doctrine that we are created in the image of God gives a solid foundation for human freedom and moral significance. Created in the image of God. This is where the whole thing starts. If you can't see man as created in the image of God, you'll never be able to pull life together. Kind of makes sense, too, what the Apostle Paul finally said on this. He said in Romans 1, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And it goes on every day. It is so common in schools and universities that everybody is beginning to take it for granted as though it were truth. Whereas, in fact, the truth is simply not being told. There are so many lessons to be learned on all this. And one of them is, if we keep on suppressing the knowledge of God in our schools and our society, that we are headed for a tsunami of the worst kind.